John Mearsheimer, you may remember him. He's one of the best known analysts of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. He's the University of Chicago political science professor, also West Point grad who served in the military as an Air Force officer. He's the one who gave the talk about why Ukraine is the West's fault, which he gave 7 years ago. He talked about NATO expansion being a thorn in Russia's side and warned that there could be a war if the West continued down that path, which he ended up being very accurate. And that talk has been seen now over 30 million times. Well, 2 weeks ago, he gave another speech for the Nonprofit Committee for the Republic. And I want to go over it with you because it's really important. So this time he talks about the current state of the war and how it's going to end. In fact, he gives the lead in as to what his talk's about. Let's go ahead and play that.
There are three basic questions on the table about Ukraine. The first is what caused the war? Number two is what's the state of the war today? Where are we at the moment? And then the third question is what is likely to happen moving forward? And I don't want to talk about the causes of the war. I may say a few words in the conclusion, but I'm not going to talk about the causes of the war. I want to focus mainly on where this train is headed. But to talk about where the train is headed, it's important to talk about where we are today first, and then segue in to talking about the future. And I'm going to make two arguments. The first argument is that there's no chance of a meaningful peace agreement. There may be at some point in a distant future a ceasefire, and that will then turn into a frozen conflict. But the chances of resolving this in any meaningful way are remarkably small, in my opinion. And then my second argument is that the Russians are going to win the war. They're not going to win a decisive victory, but they're going to end up conquering a huge chunk of Ukrainian territory beyond what they already have. And they're going to take Ukraine and make sure it remains a dysfunctional rump state.
Okay, so these are the points that he's going to talk about in this. He does touch a little bit on how we got to this point. Of course, he doesn't cover it in depth because he's already done that. 30 million people watched it. But he does touch on it a little bit. This is what he has to say.
Here, the United States was really in the driver's seat to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And that strategy or policy, of course, included NATO expansion, EU expansion, and turning Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy. Those three policies packaged together were all designed, again, to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. The Russians made it unequivocally clear from 2008 forward that this was unacceptable and that it was not going to happen. And they made it clear that they would destroy Ukraine as a functioning society before they would let it happen.
Okay, so very much making it clear. Now, he goes into, when he breaks down sort of what is going on now, before he gets to the actual war, he's going to go in and explain the actual battlefield at one point. But prior to that, he's talking about the existential threat and the goals of each of the players involved in the war. And those players involved are obviously Ukraine, Russia, and then there's the West. And the West can be sort of broken into the United States, which is the main player for the West. But then the European countries are also sort of minor players, even though they're very much right there in Europe, but they're still sort of minor players in the entire grand scheme of things. So he starts off first by talking about how the goals of these various different players oftentimes will result in an existential threat to another one of the players. So here he is. He's going to talk about the United States' goals in this war, in this conflict, and how these goals by the United States are an existential threat to Russia. Watch this.
Once the war starts, the United States has to stipulate what its goals are vis-a-vis Russia. And we have made it clear that our goal is to defeat the Russian military in Ukraine, to to wreck its economy and to, in effect, knock it out of the ranks of the great powers. There's also all sorts of rhetoric coming from the West and people in the administration, right, that make the argument that we should go beyond that and that we should pursue regime change. Then we should put Putin on trial. And there's even lots of talk these days about breaking apart Russia the way the Soviet Union broke apart in December 1991. This is the second layer of the existential threat. So there's no question that the Russians see themselves facing an existential threat. And I might add here that I have a number of friends who argue that the Russians are not facing an existential threat. My response to them is very simple. It doesn't matter whether you think they're facing an existential threat. The only thing that matters is whether they think they're facing an existential threat.
Okay, so he breaks that down. There's two reasons why Russia feels like they're having an existential threat. And that is the first, which is the NATO expansion, which is what he's talked about in the past and also touched on briefly, which was that the goal is to make Ukraine a Western bulwark right on Russia's borders. That's an existential threat. The second existential threat is wrecking its economy, knocking out of the ranks of the great powers, potentially regime change, potentially breaking Russia up. That these are all existential threats to Russia. So that is why they're pursuing what they're pursuing. Now he's going to talk about Russia's goals in this entire thing and who that's an existential threat to. Here's that.
Now, a lot of people think that the Russians are bent and have been bent since February 22nd, it's February 24th, 2022, in conquering all of Ukraine and in absorbing it into a greater Russia. The Russians have never been interested in that, and they're not going to try to do that. What the Russians are interested in doing is capturing a substantial portion of Ukraine and also making Ukraine a dysfunctional rump state. They have already formally annexed 4 oblasts plus the Crimea, and they have made it clear they have no intention of giving that territory up. I might add here that they don't control all 4 of those oblasts completely at this point in time. But those 4 oblasts plus Crimea make up 23% of Ukraine's territory. I also believe that they will take the 4 oblasts that are immediately to the west of those 4 oblasts, and this includes Odessa and Kharkiv. And once they do that, they will control 46% of Ukrainian territory.
So he goes on to say, controlling 46% of Ukraine's territory is obviously an existential threat to Ukraine. So the United States' goals are an existential threat to Russia. Russia's goals in this war of taking much of that eastern land from Ukraine, the Russian native speakers, is obviously an existential threat to Ukraine. He goes on also to talk about in this that Russia is not going to expand. Some people believe that Russia's going to expand and try to take all of Ukraine. He says that's not something that they want to do. They don't want to swallow a porcupine. He says that that many people in the western part of Ukraine they speak Ukrainian, they're very much nationalistically Ukrainian, and they hate Russians. And so there's no reason why Russia would want to take over a region that hates them so fiercely and will constantly give them headaches. On the other hand, they could take the Russian territories that are mostly filled with ethnic Russians speaking Russian, and those people are not going to be resistant to being under the rule of Russia at that point. To them, it's like Ukraine or Russia, okay. So he's saying that that's going to be ultimately their goal. Nonetheless, that's still 46% of Ukraine's territory. So that would be an existential threat to Ukraine. Now, if Ukraine also feels, and again, as he says, it doesn't really matter if you think Russia's facing an existential threat or not, as long as they think they are, that's the only thing that matters. Same thing for Ukraine. It doesn't matter if they're not actually facing an existential threat that Russia's just going to come in and take the Russian speaking and leave the rest of Ukraine. What matters is if Ukraine believes they're going to take all of Ukraine, that's an existential threat. But in reality, if Russia's goal is to just demolish Ukraine, to make it a rump state, obviously this is an existential threat to Ukraine, right? So that's pretty obvious. Okay, so he does talk about now Europe's goals and the threat. So this is kind of the minor when it comes to NATO. NATO, the United States is the major. Europe is sort of the minor in it. So this is what he says about Europe's goals and threat.
But I would argue that virtually every country in Europe depends for its security on NATO. This is not talked about much in the West. But the fact is that deep down, European leaders completely understand that NATO provides security for them. It's their security umbrella. And the great fear here is that if we lose in Ukraine, it will do significant damage, maybe even destroy the alliance. And therefore, people are deeply committed to making sure that that doesn't happen. And I sense that is, in effect, an existential threat.
He also mentions in his speech China, and he says that one of the existential threats that NATO and the West, and the United States in particular, might feel is that China's a bigger threat to the United States. And because of that, losing this war would showcase weakness that they don't want to showcase in the face of China. So that's one point he brings up. Now he's going to talk about Ukraine's existential threat, which I think is pretty obvious. Here it is.
Let me say a few words about the Ukrainians now. Their threat environment. They view the Russians as an existential threat. This is really a no-brainer. Given what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, it's clear that Ukrainians think they are.
Yeah. Obviously, Ukraine is experiencing an existential threat. And I don't think anybody should minimize that or ignore that Ukrainians, and we'll get into it, he talks a little bit about what's happening on the battlefield, and it is pretty atrocious what is happening. This is ultimately a proxy war between the West, United States really more fundamentally, and Russia, and Ukraine is really sort of stuck in the middle of all this. And what is happening to them is it's really, truly horrendous. So now he is going to talk about the battlefield. He's going to talk about what type of war this is, where we're at on the battlefield, and who's winning the war and who's going to win the war. Watch this.
Now, let me say a few words about the battlefield. It's very important to understand that this is a war of attrition. The basic goal of each side is to bleed the other side white. This is not a war of maneuver. There are no blitzkriegs here. This is Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali standing toe-to-toe and beating the hell out of each other. This is a battle like World War I, fights at Verdun, at the Somme, and so forth and so on. It's a classic war of attrition.
So he goes on to talk about what is needed to win a war of attrition, that these two are just pummeling each other at this point, and you need three things to win a battle like this. First, you need resolve, population, and then you need artillery. So when he talks about resolve, he says there's really no meaningful difference between the two. They both have the same level of resolve. Obviously, Ukraine has the resolve to try to remain a sovereign country, not to be turned into a rump state, not to be broken up in half. That is Ukraine's motivation. That's their resolve. So they have the resolve to stick this through because they don't want to end up being just a rump state. Russia has the resolve to see this through because they view this as an existential crisis as well, as an existential threat. They don't want a Western bulwark on their borders. They don't want nukes on their borders aimed at them. They view Ukraine as their little brother. They've viewed them this forever, Ukraine and Belarus for that matter. And they're basically beating the snot out of their little brother for even challenging them. That's ultimately the way they're feeling about it. They're saying, how dare you? You're a traitor to the family if you're courting these people over here that have made it clear that they do not like us, they want to challenge us, they want to break us up, they want regime change, they don't want Russia to exist, and you're playing to them. You're dating them. You're trying to marry them. We're going to make sure you can't even do that. So he says the resolve is no different for either side. They're both going to see this through to the end, whatever that end is. Population, he goes through the population of the two, and he says, going into the war, Ukraine had far less people than the Russians. It was about three Ukrainians to every 5 Russians in the battle. Now they're saying it's 5 to 1. So sorry, it was 3 to 1, and now it's 5 to 1 because there's been a lot of refugees. A lot of people have fled. So now people are leaving Ukraine. There's 8 million who have left the country, mostly men who fled. 3 million of those have gone to Russia, of those refugees. So now looking at the population, the demographics of this war, there are 5 Russians to 1 Ukrainian. So it's not on their side. The population is just not on their side. He also mentions during this, before we get to the artillery, and I'll let him explain that in a clip, but he mentions that in 2022, Ukraine had the upper hand in this battle, and they were kind of on the winning side of this. And that's often the case when you're invading another country. If you invade another country and it's their home turf, you don't have home court advantage, right? So he said Ukraine had the upper hand in all of 2022, most of 2022, but now Russia has the upper hand. It is 2023. He says that Ukraine has been preparing for this counteroffensive, which they're in the middle of doing right now. We're not seeing much. Even pro-Ukrainian analysts are looking at the current counteroffensive saying, it's not so great. It's pretty weak. And he said, Ukraine didn't even really want to do the counteroffensive. They're sort of being shoved into it by the West. They're being forced to do it. They don't really want to do it because they know that they're just being pummeled on the battlefield. So then he goes into artillery, and he says, really, artillery is the determining factor of who is going to win the war. Now, remember, this is a West Point grad. He says that this is the type of stuff they learned when they were learning military strategy, is that artillery is the key. And this is what he says about the artillery difference between the two countries.
Then we come to the artillery imbalance. Almost all of the reports on that balance say the number is either 5 to 1, 7 to 1, or maybe 10 to 1 in the Russians' favor. This has massive consequences. Massive consequences. You just want to think about what this war is all about. It's 2 armies standing toe-to-toe, trying to kill each other with massive amounts of firepower. And one side has a 5 to 1 or a 7 to 1 or a 10 to 1 advantage. The side that's on the lower end of that ratio is in the deep kimchi. This is really horrendous. And by the way, that country that's on the downside of that ratio in artillery also is on the downside in the population ratio.
So this is why he says Russia's going to ultimately win this. It's not going to be, and he's going to get into the ending of this, whether there's going to be a peace agreement or how this is going to end. He's going to talk about that. But this is why he's saying Russia's ultimately going to win. They've got a population advantage over Ukraine. They have an artillery advantage over Ukraine, and they have the same resolve as Ukraine. So they're not going to back down. They're going to win this thing, and that's that. He then goes on and talks about, I want to play this next clip for you because I think it's really important to understand the death and destruction that's happening on the battlefield and how desperate Ukraine is on this. So watch this. It's very, to me, this makes me pretty emotional. But go ahead and watch this.
It's quite clear that Ukraine is engaged, from their point of view, in a total war. They have mobilized their entire society. They have soldiers who are as old as all of us out there fighting. They have old dogs and young dogs, lots of untrained people. It's because they're desperate. It's because they're desperate.
That to me right there, listen, and he's totally right. Russia's just sent in certain groups to fight this. They haven't even mobilized their entire military on this, and they're certainly not sending in untrained civilians into Ukraine. There's been some chatter about untrained prisoners that they sent in or whatnot. But for the most part, they have not mobilized their society. Ukraine is completely mobilized. This country is desperate. They're throwing old men at this war. Civilians, untrained people are in this war. And this right here is why I get very frustrated with, though I have agreed with John Mearsheimer from the very beginning as to why this war has happened, the expansion of NATO. This is very much the West's fault, poking the bear with Russia, constantly aggravating them, getting them to this point, which is really, truly one of the faults of the United States. And they should do everything, our government should do everything that it can to put an end to this war, to seek a peace agreement, to back off from Ukraine, but they refuse to. They're just going all in. And the people of Ukraine are the ones who suffer. It's the people who suffer. And to think about old men, I couldn't even imagine my father, for example, being thrown into this war in order to potentially push back Russia turning the nation into a rump state, or to have untrained people being thrown into this war. That desperation is incredibly sad and horrible. And anybody who champions what Russia is doing, I have a very, I don't agree that Russia's doing the right thing by doing this. I don't think there's any war where there's the right thing, these are the good guys, and the good guys are going in and acting like Russia's a hero in this. People are being murdered, massacred. People who are civilians, people who are just given a gun for the first time and sent on the battlefield. That should make all of us sick. And it should make us sick that not only are the Russians doing this in order to just make an example out of Ukraine and to say, how dare you try to marry the West. I understand their anger, but I understand how the West got them into this. But we can't root for this sort of death. We shouldn't at least root for this sort of destruction. I came from, the reason my family is here in the United States is because there was a war in Vietnam where it was brother against brother. And literally in my family, I had an uncle serving on one side and an uncle on the other. It was brother against brother. And it is sickening. It's totally and completely sickening. And neither side ever feels like they're the bad guy. Every side thinks they're the good guy in the entire conflict. And the reality is the bad guy in this is the United States government and NATO that is continuing to push Ukraine, poke the bear of Russia, and throwing old men, young men, untrained people into this battle. This should make everyone completely sick. Now, where is this ending? What is going to happen? This is what Mearsheimer has to say about that.
Now, let me conclude by talking about the possibility of peace agreement. Not going to be a peace agreement, meaningful peace agreement. Not going to happen. You'll get a frozen conflict. Why is there not going to be a meaningful peace agreement? Two main reasons. The first is the territory problem. The Ukrainians want their territory back. The Russians have made it clear they're not going to get their territory back. The Russians are not going to give up those 4 oblasts they annexed. They're not going to give up Crimea. And the Ukrainians insist on getting that back. Zelensky told Xi exactly this. There'll be no peace agreement until we get all our territory back. And the Russians are going to end up taking more territory. And they're not going to give that back either. How do you square that circle? Second big problem is the neutrality problem. The Russians insist that Ukraine be neutral. Right? They've insisted this from the beginning, and their argument is if Ukraine can't be neutral, they're going to wreck it. They're going to wreck it to keep it out of NATO, or if it's in NATO, it'll be ineffective because it's wrecked. Right? The Ukrainians, on the other hand, they don't want neutrality. The Ukrainians, for completely understandable reasons, want a security guarantee from someone. Well, there's the question of who is that someone? The only someone out there is the United States or the West or NATO. And that's not going to happen, right? That's not going to happen in ways that will please the Russians. The Russians will not accept that. So how do you square that circle, right? No. 2 other quick problems here. One is the hyper-nationalism problem. There's a lot of nationalism in the air before this war started. It's morphed into hyper-nationalism, which means the hatred on both sides is off the charts. It's going to make a peace agreement very difficult. And then the other problem is that a number of leaders have made it clear that they lied to Putin about their commitment to the Minsk agreement. You remember the Minsk agreement, which was formulated in late 2015, was designed to shut down the conflict in the Donbass. And Putin was deeply committed to making the Minsk agreement work because he did not want to invade Ukraine. Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, Petro Poroshenko, and Zelensky himself have all said they never had any interest in making Minsk work, and all they were doing was buying time to build up Ukraine so it would be in a better position to fight Russia. Trust? There's no trust on the Russian side because of this. So you see, you have a problem involving territory, a problem involving neutrality, hypernationalism, and zero trust. You're not going to get a meaningful peace agreement. You're going to get a frozen conflict. Let me conclude by just very briefly saying that what's remarkable about this case is that there were a significant number of people in the United States who argued that expanding NATO was going to lead to disaster. It included people like George Kennan. It included people like the actual Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, and the actual chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Clinton administration, saying this was a disaster in the making. It included people like Paul Nitze and Jack Matlock, of course. There were a panoply of impressive intellects who said that this was a prescription for disaster. And you know what? They were right. And the end result is we are in this situation where enormous damage has already been done to Ukraine, most importantly, but to the West, to Russia, and to the United States. And with the passage of time, I'm sad to say, it's only going to get worse.
So that is unfortunately his prediction, which is that this doesn't really end, that this just marches us really into another very, very cold war with Russia, that the fighting itself will end. Russia will end up with 4 oblasts, maybe 8 oblasts, but Ukraine will be left as a rump state. But otherwise, thinking that we're going to go back to the way it was before 2022, it's just not going to happen. We're going to have this very hostile relationship with Russia. Probably you can add China to that mix soon enough. And so that's where we're at with this. And he's right. You know, Minsk, when they said, oh, well, the Minsk, you know, why would Russia say, okay, let's agree to a peace agreement when Minsk, now they've admitted, was just to buy time and that they didn't mean any of those promises? Why would Russia trust us after we've expanded NATO, after shaking their hand and saying we're not going to expand NATO? There's absolutely no trust there. So there's no reason for Russia, rightfully, to trust anything the West says. That's gone, rightfully so. The one thing, though, is that in the end, you know, he mentions the nationalism and the hyper-nationalism, and that is one of the things that Putin has said that he's fighting in Ukraine is the Nazis, right? And we've seen there's definitely nationalism, there's definitely Nazis in Ukraine. That's undeniable, for sure. But Mearsheimer is right when he says now it's worse. This didn't make the problem better. It actually made it worse. The people who were hyper-nationalist, that were pro-Ukraine, totally against Russians, because remember, the Nazism in Ukraine was really against Russians, against ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, and that's who they were targeting. Now that's worse. Western Ukraine is going to be even more so in this way. They're even more so going to hate Russians. And that is still going to be on their border. I mean, at the end of the day, Russia takes 4 or 8 oblasts. Guess who's still on their border? Ukraine. At the end of the day, that rump state of Ukraine, the Western whatever's left, decides to join NATO. Guess what's on Russia's border? Nukes in NATO. It doesn't really change that particular issue. NATO on my border, nukes on my border, Nazis on my border. Doesn't change that at the end of this. So ultimately, this is, I agree with Mearsheimer in his analysis after listening to him. I think he makes a really great point that this is really ultimately just meant to hobble Ukraine, turn it into a rump state. It's not necessarily about those other things that have been listed. This is just meant to turn it into a nothingness, essentially, a rump state. So interesting talk by Mearsheimer, very informative. He's been dead on the money previously, probably is again. So that's where we're at with that. So there you go. Well, the biggest summer secret to great looking, glowing summer skin is a lot more than just staying hydrated and using sun protection. It's having great skincare products from our friends at Genucel. Sun exposure, dehydrated skin, dark spots, even puffy bags under the eyes are a problem for all of us, but thankfully Genucel has the perfect answer. They've got this curated summer essentials package. This limited edition package includes their one-of-a-kind ultra retinol super moisturizer that uses a powerful plant extract alternative to retinol without the harsh side effects, and it's perfectly safe to use in the summer sun, which is always my big issue. I love using retinol products, but in the summer, you got to tone it down, but not when you're using Genucel's products. Plus, you're going to get Genucel's classic skincare therapy for under eye bags and puffiness and concentrated vitamin C serum to nourish your skin for a visibly clear complexion. A lot of people forget about the vitamin C. You need that vitamin C in your skincare. You're going to get this glow. It is just going to make you look really wonderful. So go to genucel.com/Kim, and you're going to get your Genucel Summer Essentials package. And just for the summer, every subscription order includes a customized summer spa gift box, absolutely free. So again, go to genucel.com/Kim. If you use Kim in the checkout, you're going to get a promo 10% off in addition. So go to genucel.com/Kim or use the promo code Kim. Either way, you're going to get yourself a discount on all of these products. And they are really great products. I first was introduced to them by seeing someone with the best skin I'd ever seen. I asked her, what are you using? She says Genucel. So here we are, Genucel. All right, guys, genucel.com/Kim.